The email arrived while I was sitting in my car engine off, keys still in my hand. I had just pulled into the parking lot outside my grandmother's assisted living facility, the same place I had been visiting every Sunday for the past year. I hadn't even unbuckled my seatbelt yet when my phone buzzed. One notification, subject line short enough to read without opening it. Family update, please read. I already knew it wasn't good news. My name is Nora Whitfield. I was 31 years old, then old enough to recognize the tone of things before words were even spoken. Old enough to know when someone says family update, what they usually mean is this has already been decided. I didn't open the email right away. I sat there watching the building's automatic doors slide open and closed for other visitors. Couples, adult children, a nurse pushing a wheelchair with practiced ease, life moving forward without waiting for permission. Finally, I opened it. The message was from my older sister, Elaine. Short, polite, efficient. She wrote that after careful discussion, the family had agreed it was time to restructure grandmother's estate planning, for clarity, for simplicity, for everyone's benefit. She said they would be meeting with an attorney later that week and wanted to loop me in. Loop me in. That phrase landed heavier than anything else she wrote. I read the email twice. There was no question in it, no request for my input, just information, the kind you give someone after the door has already closed. I locked my phone and leaned my head back against the seat. If you had asked me then, I would have said everything was fine between my sister and me. Not close, not warm, but functional. We talked on holidays, we shared updates about work. We existed in the same family orbit without colliding too often. What I didn't understand yet was that functionality is not the same as trust. I went inside to see my grandmother anyway. She was sitting in her usual chair by the window, a blanket folded neatly over her knees. When she saw me, her face lit up in that way that still surprised me, like she had been waiting for me specifically, not just someone. "You're early," she said. I smiled. Traffic was kind. She reached for my hand and held it longer than usual. That should have been my first warning. We talked about small things. The weather, the food, a woman down the hall who played the piano too loudly in the evenings. She laughed, then went quiet, her thumb tracing slow circles on my knuckles. "Nora," she said finally. "Has Elaine talked to you?" I felt something tighten in my chest. "About what I asked." She hesitated. That hesitation told me more than any answer could have. "They've been coming by," she said. "Your sister and her husband, asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "The kind you ask when you're counting," she didn't say. "The kind you ask when you're planning," she didn't say. Instead, she said, "About the house, about accounts, about what happens next." I kept my face neutral. I had learned that skill young, learned how to listen without reacting, learned how to be calm so other people wouldn't feel uncomfortable. "They just want to make sure everything's taken care of," I said. She looked at me then, really looked at me. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people take care of things for themselves first." That night back in my apartment, I opened the email again. This time I read it line by line. There it was. The subtle shift in language. The way Elaine wrote "we" when she meant herself. The way my role was implied, not defined. The way my grandmother was spoken about as if she were already absent. I thought about how often I had been the reliable one. The one who showed up. The one who drove across town when Grandma forgot her medications. The one who stayed on hold with insurance companies and filled out forms in tiny print because no one else wanted to deal with it. Elaine lived 2 hours away. She had a bigger house, a louder voice, a husband who liked to talk about investments and opportunity. She was good at sounding reasonable. I replied with one sentence. "Thanks for the update. I'd like to be present for any legal discussions." Her response came the next morning. "Of course, we'll keep you posted." Nothing else. The meeting happened without me. I found out 3 days later when a calendar invitation appeared on my phone. Not an invitation exactly, a forwarded confirmation, attorney's office, time and date already passed. When I called Elaine, she sounded surprised that I was upset. "Oh, that was just preliminary," she said. "Nothing was finalized." "Then why wasn't I there?" I asked. She laughed lightly, the way people do when they think someone is being dramatic. "Nora, you always overthink things. We're just trying to make this easier on Grandma." Easier. I looked around my apartment. The stacks of paperwork I kept organized in labeled folders. The calendar reminders I'd set for Grandma's appointments. The notes on my fridge with times and names and phone numbers. Easier for who? That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not fear, awareness. This wasn't about helping my grandmother. It was about managing me. And the worst part was realizing how natural it felt to them to do it without asking. I didn't argue, I didn't accuse, I didn't raise my voice. I did something quieter. I scheduled my own appointment with a lawyer. I didn't know yet how far this would go. I didn't know how many things I was about to lose before I gained anything back. All I knew was this. Whatever they were planning, they had already decided I would be last to know. And I was done letting silence make me invisible. The lawyer's office smelled like coffee and old paper, the kind of place where decisions outlive the people who make them. Her name was Denise Harper, late 50s, calm eyes, no rush in the way she spoke. She listened while I explained everything from the email to the missed meeting to my grandmother's quiet warning. When I finished, she didn't react the way I expected. She didn't frown. She didn't gasp. She didn't say this was terrible. She nodded. I see this more often than people think, she said. It usually starts small. Small was exactly the word I would have used. A meeting, a calendar invite, a decision framed as convenience. Nothing dramatic enough to protest without sounding unreasonable. Your grandmother's capacity, Denise asked. Still intact, I said. Slower but clear. She knows what she wants. Good, Denise replied. That matters. She explained the basics. Existing documents. Power of attorney. How easily authority can shift if no one pushes back early. How silence is often interpreted as consent. What do you want, she asked. The question caught me off guard. I want to be included, I said finally. She smiled gently. Then you'll need to do more than hope they remember you. That afternoon, I called my grandmother and asked if she would be willing to meet Denise with me. She didn't hesitate. Yes, she said. I was hoping you'd ask. The meeting was set for the following week. I informed Elaine by email. I've scheduled a legal consultation with Grandma present. Please let me know if you'd like to attend. Her reply came hours later. We already have counsel. This feels redundant. Redundant. As if my involvement were an inefficiency. I didn't respond. The week between stretched longer than it should have. Elaine called once, then twice. Left voicemails that sounded cheerful but carried a thin edge of irritation. Nora, you're making this complicated, she said in one message. We're all on the same side. I listened to it once, then deleted it. The day of the meeting, Elaine and her husband showed up anyway. They arrived 10 minutes late. Elaine wearing a practiced smile. Her husband, Martin, shaking Denise's hand like he was closing a deal. They spoke first. They talked about responsibility, about efficiency, about how Grandma shouldn't be burdened with decisions anymore, about how someone needed to step up and manage things properly. Elaine glanced at me only once, brief, dismissive. When Denise asked my grandmother what she wanted, the room went quiet. I want my wishes followed, Grandma said, not interpreted. Martin shifted in his chair. Elaine reached for Grandma's hand. Of course, Mom. Don't call me that, Grandma said gently. I'm still myself. I watched my sister freeze for half a second before recovering. That was when Denise spoke. There seems to be some confusion about authority, she said calmly. At this point, nothing changes without your grandmother's direct consent. Elaine smiled tightly. We understand that. But I saw it then. The flicker of annoyance. The realization that this wasn't going to move as quickly as she'd planned. After the meeting, Elaine cornered me in the parking lot. You blindsided us, she said. I asked to be included, I replied. This was unnecessary. For you, I said. She stared at me, then laughed softly. You really think you can handle this? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because something had shifted, not externally, internally. I wasn't asking anymore. I was positioning. And for people who are used to deciding quietly that change is unsettling, I drove home that evening with my phone face down on the passenger seat, feeling the weight of what I'd just started. It still looked like a family disagreement from the outside, but I knew better. This wasn't about care. It was about control. And it was only getting started. Control doesn't announce itself. It creeps in through logistics, through schedules, through the assumption that someone else will handle things because they always have. By the time you notice, you're already standing outside a door you used to have a key to. The first sign came 2 weeks later, disguised as routine. I showed up at my grandmother's facility on a Sunday afternoon, the same time I always did. Same parking spot, same bag of her favorite tea cookies. I signed in at the front desk without thinking. The receptionist looked at her screen, then at me. Oh, she said, you're not on the approved visitor list anymore. I felt the words before I understood them. What do you mean? I asked. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. We were given an updated list. Family requested changes. Family. I took a slow breath. Who requested it? She glanced down. Your sister and her husband. There it was. The quiet removal. No confrontation. No warning. Just a line edited out of a document. I visit every week, I said calmly. My grandmother expects me. I'm sorry, the receptionist said. You'll need authorization. Authorization. I stepped outside before I said something sharp. Sat in my car with the engine off, hands resting in my lap, and let the reality settle. They hadn't just moved ahead without me. They were actively moving me out. I called Elaine from the parking lot. She answered on the third ring. What's going on? I asked. Her sigh was immediate. Practiced. Nora, we talked about this. Grandma gets confused when too many people come and go? That's not true, I said. It's what the staff observed, she replied smoothly. Then why didn't you tell me? Another sigh, slightly irritated now. Because you always take things personally. There it was, the familiar dismissal. The reframing of harm as sensitivity. You removed me from her visitor list, I said. You don't get to do that. We're acting in her best interest, Elaine said. Someone has to. I hung up without responding. Not because I didn't have words. Because I finally understood that words were the tool being used against me. I called Denise from the car. That's a problem, she said after I explained. A significant one. What do? I asked. You document it, she said, and you stop assuming good faith. That afternoon, Denise sent a formal letter to the facility clarifying that my grandmother retained full decision-making capacity and that no changes to visitation were to be made without her explicit consent. I returned 2 days later. This time, the receptionist smiled apologetically and handed me a visitor badge. She asked for you, she said quietly. My grandmother looked smaller than usual when I walked into her room. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone who had been spoken over too many times in a short span. They told me you were busy, she said. I sat beside her and took her hand. I wasn't. She nodded once. I thought so. We didn't talk about Elaine. We didn't need to. Silence in that moment wasn't avoidance. It was alignment. That night, the next move came. An email from Elaine copying me and Denise. Subject: temporary power of attorney discussion. Temporary discussion. She wrote that due to increasing concerns about Grandma's health and stress levels, they believed it was time to assign a temporary power of attorney to manage affairs smoothly. She emphasized this was not permanent and was simply a practical step. Practical. I read it without reacting, forwarded it to Denise. Her response was blunt. This is the line. The POA meeting was scheduled without asking me if I could attend. Again. This time I didn't object emotionally. I objected legally. Denise filed a notice of objection and requested a capacity evaluation before any transfer of authority. Elaine called me that night, her voice tight. You're making this adversarial, she said. No, I replied. I'm making it accurate. We're just trying to help Grandma, she snapped. Then let her speak, I said. She went quiet. Then she said something that shifted everything. You always needed to feel important. I closed my eyes. That sentence explained more than she realized. To her, my involvement had never been contribution. It was ego, interference, noise. To me, it had been responsibility. And now it was inconvenient. The evaluation happened the following week. A licensed physician, neutral, thorough. My grandmother answered questions slowly but clearly. Named dates, explained her preferences, expressed frustration at being spoken about like she wasn't in the room. The report was unequivocal. She was competent. Elaine's reaction was swift. She pivoted. If she couldn't take authority through incapacity, she would do it through pressure. The facility began calling Elaine instead of me for updates. The financial advisor Elaine had chosen sent me summaries after decisions had already been discussed. Changes were framed as minor, informational, already in motion. I noticed something else too. The way Elaine spoke to me changed. She stopped explaining. She started informing, like I was an employee who needed to be managed. That was when I lost my place. Not in the family, in the structure. I was no longer a participant. I was an obstacle. I told Denise I was ready for what she asked. To stop playing defense, I said. Because at some point, silence stops being patience and starts becoming permission. I wasn't angry. I wasn't emotional. I was done pretending this was still about care. This was about power. And if I didn't act, I would be written out of the story entirely. That was the moment I stopped waiting for their next move and started preparing mine. I learned quickly that once you are repositioned as an obstacle, everything you do is framed as resistance. The first thing Denise did was simple. She asked for documents, not explanations, not apologies. Paper. Updated visitor logs from the facility. Copies of the emails Elaine sent on my behalf, records of meetings I hadn't attended but was supposedly included in. The paper trail that, when lined up, told a very different story than the one my sister liked to narrate. When people are confident they're right, they're sloppy with documentation. They assume no one will look closely. Elaine had assumed that about me. The second thing Denise did was slower. She asked me to step back. "Let them move," she said. "Watch where they step." It went against every instinct I had. I was used to fixing problems early, intervening before things escalated. But Denise was right. I needed to see how far Elaine would go if she thought no one was pushing back. It didn't take long. The next update came in the form of a group email titled Care Coordination. Elaine wrote that due to scheduling conflicts, she and Martin would be taking over appointment management and financial oversight temporarily. She thanked me for my past help and said she'd keep me informed. Past help, like I'd retired from a job I'd never been paid for. I didn't respond. 2 days later, my grandmother called me directly, her voice strained. "They're talking like I'm not here," she said, "like I already belong to someone else." That night, I drove over without calling ahead. Sat with her while she folded and refolded the same napkin, a nervous habit she'd had since I was a child. "They mean well," she said after a while, repeating words that had been handed to her. "Do they ask what you want?" I asked. She shook her head slowly. "I want to stay where I am," she said. "I don't want to move. I don't want to sell anything. I don't want strangers deciding my life." Her voice wasn't dramatic, it was tired. I took notes when I got home. Dates, quotes, specific phrases. Not because I wanted ammunition, because I wanted accuracy. The escalation came disguised as generosity. Elaine sent flowers to the facility, a large arrangement, bright, public. She made sure the staff knew they were from the family. She sent me a photo of them. "Just trying to make things nicer for her," she wrote. I stared at the image longer than necessary. Performative care is louder than real care. It needs witnesses. I didn't reply. A week later, Denise forwarded me a draft document Elaine's attorney had prepared. Proposed shared oversight agreement. It was long, dense, written in neutral language that assumed cooperation. Buried on page 6 was the real shift. Decision-making authority regarding residents' asset liquidation and care providers would default to Elaine in the event of family disagreement. Family disagreement. Defined nowhere. "That's not temporary," I said to Denise over the phone. "No," she replied. "That's control with an expiration date that keeps moving. What happens if I sign nothing I asked?" "They'll claim you're uncooperative," she said, "and try to justify acting without you. And if I sign, you give them exactly what they want." That night, Elaine called me. Her voice was light, almost cheerful. "I sent over the draft," she said. "It's nothing scary, just formalizing what we're already doing." "I haven't agreed to what you're doing," I replied. She paused, then laughed softly. "Nora, you're not even there most days." "I am there," I said. "You just stop seeing it." Her tone cooled. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." There it was again, the phrase that always meant the same thing. "Stop resisting." "I won't sign," I said. Silence. "Then so you're choosing conflict." "No," I said. "I'm choosing clarity." She exhaled sharply. "You're being selfish." I ended the call. The next morning, Denise filed a formal objection to any change in authority and requested court oversight for any future decisions affecting my grandmother's residence or assets. Elaine's response was immediate. She accused me of stress-inducing behavior, of interfering, of creating unnecessary tension during a vulnerable time. I read her email without flinching. Then something unexpected happened. The facility administrator called me. "I want you to know," she said carefully. "Your grandmother asked us to include you in all discussions again, explicitly." I closed my eyes. "They can't override that," she added. "Not unless there's a court order." "Thank you," I said. That afternoon, my grandmother asked me to bring her papers. Not the ones Elaine had organized. The old ones. The ones she'd kept in a worn folder at the back of her drawer. Inside were handwritten notes, old statements, a copy of a will drafted years earlier and never updated. Elaine was barely mentioned. I felt something shift then, not triumph, responsibility. This wasn't about outmaneuvering my sister. This was about protecting someone who had trusted the wrong voice because it sounded confident. I didn't tell Elaine what I'd found. I didn't warn her what was coming. I let Denise handle the next step. A petition, not to remove Elaine, to formally establish my grandmother's stated wishes as controlling, unless she herself chose otherwise. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. When Elaine received notice, she didn't call. She sent one line. "I never thought you'd do this to me." I read it once, then archived it. Because the truth was simpler than anything she could write. She had done this first. She just hadn't expected me to stop absorbing it. By the end of the month, the court granted interim protections. Nothing could be sold, nothing could be moved, nothing could be changed without explicit approval. Elaine lost momentum, and people who rely on momentum panic when it disappears. I didn't celebrate. I watched, because I knew now that control once challenged doesn't retreat quietly. It escalates. And whatever Elaine did next would tell me exactly how far she was willing to go. Elaine didn't panic right away. That would have been easier to recognize. Instead, she went quiet in a way that felt calculated. No calls, no emails, no passive-aggressive updates. The kind of silence meant to make you doubt whether you'd imagined the threat in the first place. I'd lived long enough to know better. Silence, when used strategically, isn't peace. It's regrouping. 2 weeks passed, then 3. During that time, my grandmother seemed lighter. Not suddenly happy, not healed, but steadier. She slept better, ate more, spoke more freely when Elaine's name wasn't hovering in the room. One afternoon, as I helped her organize old photographs, she stopped and tapped a picture with her finger. "That was the last Christmas before your parents divorced," she said. I looked at the photo. Elaine and I were teenagers sitting stiffly on opposite ends of the couch, smiles too wide, shoulders tight. "She always hated that I kept things the way they were," Grandma added quietly. "She wanted everything rearranged, updated, like changing the furniture could erase what happened." I didn't respond. I let her speak. "She told me once that you were too attached," Grandma said, "that you didn't know how to move forward." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but it didn't surprise me anymore. That's when I realized Grandma continued that attachment and responsibility look the same to people who don't want either. A week later, the next move arrived. Not from Elaine, from Martin. He called in the early evening, his voice smooth and overly calm, like someone negotiating from a position he thought was still strong. "Nora," he said, as if we were old friends, "we should talk." "I'm listening," I replied. "This legal back and forth is unnecessary," he said. "It's expensive, stressful, and frankly it's starting to reflect poorly." "On whom?" I asked. He paused. "On the family." There it was. The implication that my actions were the embarrassment, not the behavior that caused them. "We're willing to compromise," he continued. "If you step back from daily involvement, Elaine is open to keeping you informed." I almost smiled. "You mean the role I had before?" I said. "No," he corrected gently, "less disruptive." I didn't raise my voice, I didn't argue. "I'm not interested," I said. His tone cooled. "You should think carefully. This can go in directions you may not like." "I already have," I replied. He hung up without another word. That same night, Denise called me. "They've requested a formal mediation," she said, "voluntary, off the record." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means they want to control the narrative," she said, "and avoid a judge seeing patterns." "Do we agree?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "Yes," she said, "but on our terms." The mediation was scheduled at a neutral office downtown, a bland room with too much lighting and not enough personality. Elaine arrived first, composed, dressed professionally, her posture signaling confidence she was trying hard to maintain. Martin followed. He didn't look at me. The mediator explained the rules: neutrality, respect, confidentiality. Elaine spoke first. She talked about love, about concern, about wanting to reduce stress for Grandma and for everyone involved. She framed her actions as burden-bearing, responsibility, sacrifice. When it was my turn, I said very little. I described facts. Dates, decisions made without consultation, documents presented after the fact, the visitor list incident, the attempt to secure power of attorney without evaluation. I didn't speculate about intent. I didn't describe how it felt. I let the pattern speak. The mediator's questions shifted after that, became more precise, less sympathetic to Elaine's narrative. Why wasn't Nora included in the initial meeting? Why was visitation altered without consent? Why was authority reassigned in draft documents without agreement? Elaine's answers grew shorter, less polished. At one point she snapped, "Because she complicates everything." The room went quiet. The mediator looked at her carefully. "Can you explain what you mean by that?" Elaine glanced at Martin, then back at the table. "She doesn't know when to let go," she said. "She needs to be needed." I felt the statement pass through me without landing. That sentence had powered our dynamic for years. It just sounded different in a room with witnesses. The mediation ended without resolution, which was exactly what Denise wanted. 2 days later, Elaine made a mistake. She tried to move money, a modest amount. Not enough to raise alarms, just enough to test the boundary. A transfer from one of Grandma's secondary accounts into an account Martin controlled for bill management. Denise caught it within hours, because we had already asked the bank to flag activity. Because Elaine had assumed oversight was passive, because people who are used to quiet control underestimate preparation. Denise filed an emergency notice with the court. This time the response was not neutral. The judge ordered a full review. All accounts frozen pending evaluation. All authority suspended until resolution. Elaine called me that night. She wasn't calm anymore. "You did this," she said. "No," I replied. "You did." Her voice cracked. "I was trying to help." "Then why didn't you ask?" I said. She didn't answer. Instead, she said something else. "You think you've won?" "I think this isn't about winning," I said. "It's about stopping." She hung up. That night, I sat in my apartment, lights low, paperwork spread across the table. Not because I needed to look at it again, but because I needed to sit with the reality of where things had landed. I hadn't shouted, I hadn't accused, I hadn't demanded apologies. I had let the structure reveal itself. And now that it had, it was collapsing under its own weight. But this wasn't the end. People who lose control rarely accept it quietly. They look for leverage elsewhere. And Elaine still had one thing she hadn't used yet: public perception. I knew that before it happened. I just didn't know how far she would take it. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. "Is everything okay with Grandma? Elaine sounds worried." That's when I understood. The next phase wasn't legal. It was reputational. And it was about to get ugly. Reputation moves faster than truth. By the time I realized Elaine had started calling relatives, the story had already spread far enough that correcting it would have sounded defensive. She hadn't accused me directly. She didn't need to. She used concern like a veil. "She's under a lot of stress. She's taken on too much. She thinks she knows what's best." Those sentences did their work quietly. They framed me as overwhelmed without calling me unstable, as controlling without calling me cruel. It was a familiar tactic, one that works best when people already expect the reliable one to crack eventually. The first call came from my aunt in Ohio. We spoke politely. She asked questions that sounded gentle but landed sharp. "Are you sure you're not pushing too hard?" she said. "Elaine's just worried." "I'm sure," I replied. The second came from a cousin who had never visited Grandma once in the last 5 years, but suddenly felt informed enough to advise me on compassion. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I thanked them for checking in and ended the calls quickly. Then Denise called. "They're laying groundwork," she said. "This is about perception." "For what?" I asked. "For capacity," she replied. The words settled in my chest. Elaine wasn't trying to win the argument anymore. She was trying to change the frame. If she could convince enough people that I was too emotionally invested, too rigid, too close, then every boundary I set could be recast as evidence. "She's obsessed. She can't let go. She's acting irrational." Those labels don't sound dangerous until they're attached to legal processes. Denise was direct. "We need to get ahead of this." I knew what she meant before she said it. Documentation, evaluation, proof. Not because I doubted myself, because doubt, when repeated by others, has a way of seeping into places it doesn't belong. I scheduled a full evaluation with my primary care physician and a licensed psychologist. Not because anyone required it, because I refused to let implication become fact. The appointments were thorough. Questions about sleep work, stress, decision-making, memory tests, cognitive assessments, conversations that felt clinical but fair. At the end of it, the psychologist looked at me and said something that stayed with me. "You are not distressed," she said. "You are decisive." People confuse the two when they don't benefit from the difference. The report was clear, competent, stable, no concerns. Denise added it to our file without ceremony. "That's one door closed," she said. Elaine escalated anyway. She sent an email to the court-appointed mediator claiming communication had broken down entirely, that I refused to cooperate, that Grandma was distressed because of family conflict. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so precise. Denise responded with timestamps, records, the physician's report, a log of every attempt I'd made to communicate respectfully. The mediator scheduled a follow-up. Elaine arrived late, again. This time her composure cracked. "I don't recognize you anymore," she said across the table. "You used to be easier." The mediator glanced up. "Easier how?" Elaine caught herself too late. She corrected quickly, more flexible. I didn't react. I didn't need to. Because flexibility to people like Elaine had always meant compliance. The mediator asked about the unauthorized transfer attempt. Elaine blamed Martin. Martin blamed miscommunication. Neither took responsibility. Then the mediator asked my grandmother a simple question. Do you feel pressured by anyone? She answered without hesitation. Yes, she said. When I say no, they ask again. Elaine looked stunned. That moment changed the temperature of the room. After the meeting, Martin pulled me aside in the hallway. This doesn't have to destroy the family, he said quietly. I met his gaze. It's not my job to preserve a structure that depends on my silence, I replied. He looked at me for a long moment, then shook his head. You're making enemies. No, I said, I'm revealing them. The next move came not from Elaine, but from the bank. They froze additional accounts pending review, requested updated authorizations, asked for clarification on oversight. Elaine called me that night, her voice brittle. You've turned everyone against me, she said. I didn't turn anyone, I replied. They asked questions. She laughed once, sharp and humorless. You always needed to be right. The line landed flat. This isn't about being right, I said. It's about being done. Silence. Then she said the thing she'd been circling for months. You think Grandma loves you more. I closed my eyes. That's what this is, she continued, voice rising. You want to win her. You want to prove you're better. No, I said quietly. I want her protected. That's the same thing to you, Elaine snapped. I let the words hang. Because there it was. The truth she'd never admitted. To her, love was a competition. Authority was affection. Control was care. We were speaking different languages. The court date was set for early fall. Not a trial, a review, a structured examination of decisions made and authority assumed. Elaine's attorney requested additional time. Denise denied the extension. Momentum is not on their side anymore, she told me. I felt it too. Not victory. Stability. The kind that comes when facts stop being negotiable. A week before the hearing, my grandmother asked me something I hadn't expected. What will happen to you when this is over? She asked. I thought about it. I'll keep living, I said, just without this. She nodded slowly. I should have stopped it sooner, she said. You couldn't have known, I replied. She squeezed my hand. You knew, she said. You just didn't let it take you. That night I packed a folder. Not thick, just clean, organized, final. Denise called it a closing argument without the speech. The story was already told. All that remained was to let it be seen. Elaine still believed this was about family loyalty. She was wrong. This was about autonomy. And autonomy once claimed does not ask permission to exist. The hearing would not be dramatic. There would be no raised voices. But it would end something permanently. And for the first time I felt ready for that. Because the fear that had once kept me quiet had nowhere left to hide. And whatever happened next, I would no longer be standing in the shadow of someone else's certainty. I would be standing in my own. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. Not imposing, not theatrical, just a long table, neutral walls, and a sense that time behaved differently there. Slower, less forgiving. Elaine sat across from me, her posture rigid, hands folded too tightly in her lap. Martin was beside her, whispering, occasionally leaning in with the kind of confidence that had always made her feel safe. Their attorney shuffled papers, already irritated by something on his screen. Denise sat next to me, calm as ever. No stack of binders, no dramatic tabs, just one folder, thin and precise. My grandmother arrived last, assisted by a staff member from the facility. She looked tired but alert. When she saw me, she nodded once, not a smile, something steadier. The judge entered without ceremony. This was not a trial, no jury, no verdict that would make headlines, just a review of conduct, authority, and intent. Elaine's attorney spoke first. He framed the situation as a misunderstanding driven by concern. He emphasized family stress, emotional responses, the difficulty of managing care when siblings disagree. He used words like fractured and unfortunate. When he finished, the judge turned to Denise. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't mirror his tone. She stated facts. Dates of meetings my sister scheduled without notice, copies of emails that informed rather than invited, documentation of the unauthorized account transfer attempt, the physician's evaluation, the psychologist's report, the facility's visitor list changes and subsequent reversal at my grandmother's request. She laid out a timeline that didn't accuse. It simply showed. The judge asked Elaine a direct question. Why was your sister excluded from initial discussions? Elaine inhaled sharply. We didn't exclude her, she said. She just wasn't as available. The judge looked down at the record. According to these emails, she requested inclusion multiple times, he said. Can you explain why meetings proceeded anyway? Elaine glanced at Martin. He said nothing. She tends to overanalyze, Elaine said finally. It slows things down. The judge nodded once, then turned to my grandmother. Is that your experience? He asked. My grandmother didn't hesitate. No, she said, she listens. The room shifted. The judge asked another question. Do you feel pressured by anyone to make decisions you don't agree with? Yes, she said again. When I say no, they try again later. Elaine's face flushed. The judge leaned back slightly. Repeated pressure after refusal is not assistance, he said. It's coercion. Elaine opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she looked unsure. The judge continued. At this time, I am ordering that all decision-making authority remains solely with your grandmother, unless she personally and explicitly delegates otherwise. Any attempts to circumvent this will be viewed unfavorably. He paused. And I am strongly advising all parties to cease unilateral actions immediately. That was it. No gavel, no dramatic close. But something had ended. Outside the building, Elaine finally spoke. You humiliated me, she said. I looked at her, really looked at her. At the anger, the fear, the disbelief that this had not gone the way she planned. I didn't say anything, I replied. She scoffed. You didn't have to. Martin pulled her toward the car, murmuring something I couldn't hear. Denise and I stood quietly until they drove away. You okay? She asked. Yes, I said, surprised to find it was true. Not relieved, not triumphant. Just steady. The days that followed were strange. Too quiet. No emails, no calls, no sudden updates. The constant tension I'd been carrying didn't disappear all at once. It loosened gradually like a muscle, realizing it no longer needed to stay clenched. At the facility, staff began calling me again. Not because I demanded it, because my grandmother asked. She's clearer when you're involved, one nurse told me. I didn't respond. I didn't need affirmation. What I needed came later. It arrived in the form of an envelope addressed to me, postmarked from Elaine's city. Inside was a copy of a document, a petition. Elaine was asking the court to formally dissolve any shared responsibility and remove herself from future decision-making. The language was cold, legal, final. Denise read it carefully. This is a retreat, she said, not an apology. I know, I replied. She's protecting herself now, Denise added. Distance is her strategy. I thought about the years of proximity I'd mistaken for connection. How closeness had always been conditional. That's fine, I said, because it was. A week later, my grandmother asked me to bring her to my apartment for the afternoon, just a visit, a change of scenery. She sat by the window, watching people pass on the sidewalk below. You know, she said, Elaine always thought being in charge meant being important. I didn't answer. She never understood that showing up quietly mattered more, she continued. She turned to me. I'm glad you didn't disappear. Neither was I. That night, alone again, I opened my laptop and drafted a single document, not a legal one, a personal one. I wrote down what I would no longer do. I would no longer explain decisions that didn't require consensus. I would no longer absorb discomfort to maintain harmony. I would no longer mistake access for love. I saved it, closed the laptop. The revenge wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exposure or punishment. It was removal. Elaine had lost access to the role she wanted, the authority she believed defined her, the narrative she controlled, and she had done it to herself. What I gained was quieter. Clarity, space, the right to exist without being managed. That was when I understood something fundamental. Power doesn't always leave loudly. Sometimes it slips away when it realizes it's no longer welcome. And once that happens, the noise stops. What remains is the truth. And the truth, when it's finally allowed to stand on its own, doesn't need anyone's permission to stay. When the noise stopped, I expected relief. What came instead was something heavier and harder to name. A strange disorientation. Like stepping off a moving walkway and realizing your body is still leaning forward, even though the ground is steady again. Elaine's retreat did not bring reconciliation. It brought absence. No messages, no updates, no awkward attempts to save face. She had chosen distance not as reflection, but as self-preservation, and I let her have it. The first real consequence showed up in small practical ways. Her name disappeared from call logs. The facility stopped asking if she would be attending care meetings. The bank redirected all inquiries back to my grandmother directly with me copied for transparency. The system recalibrated itself, and for the first time in months, nothing felt urgent. That should have been the end. It wasn't. Control doesn't always come back in the same shape. Sometimes it returns disguised as regret. 3 weeks after the hearing, Elaine emailed me. Subject line, can we talk? 2 sentences in the body. I know things got out of hand. I'd like to clear the air. I read it once. Then I closed my laptop. Not because I was angry, because the phrasing told me everything. Things got out of hand. No subject, no ownership, just an event that somehow happened on its own. Denise had warned me this might come. They test the door, she'd said, not to apologize, to see if it opens. I didn't reply. Elaine tried again a few days later. This time she called. I let it go to voicemail. Nora, she said, her voice softer than I remembered. I miss you. We don't have to talk about the legal stuff. I just want my sister back. That sentence hurt more than anything else she'd done. Not because it was sincere, because it was strategic. She was reaching for history, for guilt, for the version of me who had always stepped in when she said she was overwhelmed. I deleted the voicemail. A week later, my grandmother told me Elaine had visited her. I didn't know she was coming, she said. She cried. I waited. She said she felt shut out, Grandma continued. That she was afraid she'd lost her place in the family. I nodded slowly. And what did you tell her, I asked. That love doesn't need a title, Grandma said. And control isn't closeness. I felt something loosen in my chest. Elaine didn't come back. But the pressure shifted. Instead of pushing me directly, she began reaching outward. Mutual friends, extended family, old connections. People started asking how I was holding up. If things were calmer now. If I thought it was time to heal. Heal. The word hovered like a suggestion that something was wrong with me for not rushing toward reconciliation. I answered politely, briefly. I'm fine. And I meant it. What they didn't see was the quiet work happening underneath. My grandmother asked me to help her update her will. Not because of Elaine, because she wanted clarity. We sat at the same table where she used to do crossword puzzles, her glasses slipping down her nose as she reviewed each clause carefully. I don't want confusion, she said, or pressure. We made changes that reflected her wishes, not anyone else's expectations. Elaine's name remained, but the authority was gone. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt peace. A month later, Elaine made her final attempt. She showed up at my apartment without warning. I opened the door because I was done being startled. She looked different, thinner, tired, less sure. I just want to talk, she said. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. We can talk here, I said. She looked around like the hallway itself was an insult. I didn't mean for it to go that far, she said quickly. Martin pushed. The lawyers escalated. I lost control of it. I listened, not to absorb, to observe. And when I asked to be included, I said, she flinched. You always take things so personally, she said, falling back into habit. I shook my head. That's the problem, I said. You never did. Her eyes filled with tears, real ones this time. I don't know who I am if I'm not in charge, she whispered. There it was. Not remorse. Fear. I softened my voice. That's not my responsibility to fix. She stared at me like I'd spoken another language. I'm not cutting you out, I continued. I'm just not letting you in where you've already proven you don't respect the door. She reached for my arm. I stepped back. Please, she said. I met her gaze. No, not angry, not cruel. Final. She stood there for a moment, then nodded once stiffly. Okay, she said. I guess that's that. Yes, I replied. After she left, I didn't cry. I went back inside and sat on the couch, breathing evenly, feeling the quiet settle again. That was the moment I understood the real revenge. It wasn't the hearing. It wasn't the documents. It wasn't the boundaries. It was the fact that I no longer needed her to understand. Because needing understanding gives power. Clarity doesn't. The story wasn't over yet. But the conflict was. What remained was adjustment. And adjustment, when done honestly, always reveals who can live without control and who cannot. After Elaine left my hallway that night, I realized something unsettling. I had built my life around anticipating her reactions. Not consciously, not deliberately, but in the quiet, ordinary ways that shape behavior over time. The pause before answering, the instinct to soften, the habit of explaining myself before anyone asked. That instinct didn't disappear just because the conflict ended. It lingered. So Chapter 9 wasn't about Elaine anymore. It was about withdrawal. The weeks that followed felt deceptively calm. My grandmother's care stabilized. The court oversight became procedural, almost boring. Denise checked in less frequently, which I took as a good sign. Externally, everything looked resolved. Internally, I had to relearn how to exist without bracing. I noticed it first at work. During a meeting, a colleague questioned a decision I'd made about resource allocation. His tone was casual. Not aggressive, but my body reacted as if I were about to be overruled. I opened my mouth to justify. Then I stopped. I've reviewed the numbers, I said. This is the best option. Silence. No argument followed, no pushback. The meeting moved on. Later in my car, I sat there for a moment longer than usual. I hadn't explained, and nothing bad had happened. That pattern repeated in small ways. Declining a social invitation without an excuse. Ending a phone call when it ran long. letting someone be disappointed without rushing to fix it. Each time felt slightly wrong, like stepping outside without a coat when you're used to cold, but also lighter. One afternoon, my grandmother asked me a question that surprised me. "Are you tired?" she said. I considered it. "No," I replied. "I think I'm unlearning something." She smiled faintly. "That takes energy too." Elaine remained quiet, but the absence wasn't neutral. It created space for other voices. My aunt sent a card, no message inside, just her name. A cousin texted saying he hoped things were calmer now and that families were complicated. I didn't engage. I understood now that clarity doesn't require consensus. What surprised me was how often people tried to steer me back toward the old role without realizing it. "You're so good at keeping everyone together," one friend said. I nodded, then changed the subject. I wasn't interested in being good at that anymore. The real shift came when my grandmother asked me to attend a meeting with her financial advisor. Not because she needed help, because she wanted me there. As the advisor explained options, my grandmother interrupted him twice, asked questions, corrected assumptions. She wasn't confused. She was assertive. At the end of the meeting, she looked at me. "People mistake quiet for weakness," she said. "They forget it's often just patience." That sentence stayed with me, because patience had been my downfall. I'd waited for recognition, for fairness, for someone else to notice the imbalance and correct it. That waiting had cost me years. I didn't regret it, but I wouldn't repeat it. Late that month, Elaine sent one final email. No subject line. "I don't agree with how you handled things, but I accept that this is how it is now." No apology, no ownership. Just acceptance. I read it, then archived it. Acceptance from her was the most I was ever going to get. And I was finally okay with that. The revenge people expect is loud. It looks like exposure, like public embarrassment, like victory speeches. What I experienced was quieter and more permanent. It was watching someone realize they no longer had influence. Not because I blocked them, because there was nothing left to pull. I stopped reacting. I stopped explaining. I stopped orienting my choices around someone else's comfort. And in that absence, Elaine's power evaporated. Not all at once, but completely. The last scene of that chapter didn't happen in a courtroom or a confrontation. It happened on a Saturday morning. I was helping my grandmother water plants on her balcony. The sun was warm, the air still. She handed me the watering can, then paused. "You know," she said, "your sister always wanted to be in charge of the ending." I smiled slightly. "And you?" "I wanted peace before it," she said. We stood there quietly, watching the water soak into the soil. I thought about endings, about how often people mistake closure for reconciliation, about how sometimes the most honest ending is simply choosing not to reopen the door. That was the moment I understood the final twist of this story. Elaine thought power came from proximity, from being present, from having a say. She never realized that the moment I stopped needing her approval, the entire structure collapsed. The inheritance, the authority, the family hierarchy she'd relied on. None of it worked without my participation, and I hadn't even taken anything from her. I'd just stepped out of the role that made it possible. Chapter 9 wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive, because it was the chapter where I stopped measuring my life against what I had survived, and started measuring it against what I chose. One chapter remained, not about conflict, about consequence, and about what it actually means to win without becoming someone you don't recognize. The consequence didn't arrive as punishment. It arrived as responsibility. Once the conflict faded into background noise, the practical reality settled in. My grandmother's care was stable. The legal oversight remained in place, unobtrusive but firm. Decisions moved slowly now, deliberately, without anyone rushing to seize momentum. And for the first time, I was the one deciding how involved I wanted to be. That distinction mattered more than I expected. I began by restructuring my own life, not out of rebellion, but necessity. I moved closer to my grandmother's facility, not into her orbit, not into her shadow, just near enough that visits felt natural instead of scheduled. I changed my work hours slightly, nothing dramatic, just enough to create margin. Margin is what control takes from you first. Elaine's absence made room for something else I hadn't anticipated. Space to see how deeply her presence had shaped the dynamics around us. Staff spoke differently now. They asked questions instead of informing. They paused. They waited for answers instead of assumptions. One nurse told me quietly, "It's calmer when there's one clear voice." I understood what she meant. Not dominance. Consistency. The facility administrator asked if I'd be willing to serve as the primary contact moving forward, given the court's guidance and my grandmother's preference. I agreed, but with conditions. All decisions documented, all communication transparent. Nothing done in urgency unless there was actual urgency. No shortcuts. It felt strange drawing lines so clearly when I'd spent years smoothing them over. But clarity created trust faster than kindness ever had. At work, I noticed the shift too. Colleagues treated me differently, not with fear, with respect, the kind that comes when someone doesn't over-explain or over-accommodate, when they say what they mean and stop there. One afternoon, my manager asked me to take on a larger leadership role, more authority, more visibility. "You're steady under pressure," she said. "People follow that." I thought about it carefully before agreeing. Because I no longer accepted responsibility by default, only by choice. Elaine stayed quiet. Months passed without contact. I heard through family channels that she and Martin were struggling. Financially, emotionally. The roles they'd built their marriage around were shifting, and neither seemed sure what replaced them. I felt no satisfaction. Distance had dulled that impulse. What I felt instead was clarity about something uncomfortable. Elaine hadn't just wanted control over our grandmother's affairs. She had wanted certainty. Certainty about her importance, her authority, her place. When that certainty was challenged, she reached for power. When power failed, she retreated. That pattern no longer concerned me. The real consequence was this. I stopped being available as a stabilizing force for someone else's instability. And once that happened, everything recalibrated. Late one evening, my grandmother asked me to sit with her while she sorted through old letters, not for any reason, just because. She handed me one envelope and said, "Read this." It was from my mother, written decades earlier, long before any of us understood the roles we would grow into. The letter ended with a line that stopped me. "Teach your daughters that love doesn't mean shrinking." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back where it belonged. That night, walking home, I thought about how often women are taught that strength must be quiet and visible, self-sacrificing to be acceptable. How often dignity is mistaken for defiance when it disrupts a familiar hierarchy. The revenge in this story wasn't exposure. It wasn't humiliation. It wasn't taking something away. It was refusing to continue a pattern that required my silence to function. Elaine lost influence not because I defeated her, but because I withdrew from the system that gave her leverage. That is a consequence people rarely anticipate. The loss of audience, the loss of reaction, the loss of the person who made the imbalance sustainable. By the end of that season, my life felt quieter but not empty. It felt intentional. I no longer waited for updates. I no longer anticipated crises. I no longer rehearsed conversations that might never happen. I lived, and in doing so, I discovered something important. Winning doesn't always look like gaining ground. Sometimes it looks like standing still while someone else realizes the ground has shifted beneath them. One chapter remained, not about what was taken, but about what I chose to keep, and what I would never give away again. The first real test came quietly. No warning, no confrontation, just a moment where the old reflex tried to come back and I had to decide whether to obey it or let it pass. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that feels unfinished even while it's happening. I was leaving my grandmother's facility when my phone rang, an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but I did. It was Martin. His voice sounded thinner than I remembered, less certain, less rehearsed. "Nora," he said, as if we were still on speaking terms. "I didn't expect you to pick up." "I don't have much time," I replied. He paused, recalibrating. "Elaine isn't doing well." I waited. "She's overwhelmed," he continued. "She feels like everything was taken from her. The family, her role, her place." I said nothing. He sighed. "I was hoping you could talk to her. She listens to you. She always has." There it was. The attempt to reinstall me into the old position. Mediator, stabilizer, translator of other people's emotions. "I'm not available for that," I said. Martin sounded genuinely surprised. "She's your sister." "Yes," I said, and this is still my answer. "You don't have to punish her," he said. "I'm not," I replied. "I'm opting out." He was quiet for a moment, then tried another angle. "She thinks you wanted this," he said, "to take everything." I almost laughed but stopped myself. I didn't take anything I said. I stopped giving. He exhaled sharply. "So that's it." "That's it," I confirmed. He hung up without saying goodbye. I stood there in the parking lot, phone in my hand, noticing something strange. My heart wasn't racing. My chest wasn't tight. I didn't feel the familiar urge to replay the conversation and wonder if I'd been too cold. I felt neutral. That was new. Later that evening, I told my grandmother about the call. Not in detail, just enough to be honest. She nodded slowly. "They're learning," she said. "Learning what I asked." "That they can't lean on you anymore," she replied. I thought about that. For most of my life, being leaned on had felt like love, like proof of value, like purpose. Now it felt like weight I'd finally put down. A few weeks later, Elaine sent another message, this one longer. She wrote about loneliness, about regret, about feeling like she'd lost herself. She said she wished things had gone differently, that she hoped someday we could talk. I read it carefully, not to find fault, to find truth. What she didn't say mattered more than what she did. She didn't acknowledge the visitor list, the meetings without notice, the attempted account transfer, the pressure on our grandmother. She wrote about feelings, not actions. I typed a response, then deleted it. Typed another, deleted that too. Finally, I wrote one sentence. I hope you find what you're looking for. I didn't offer a meeting. I didn't offer reassurance. I didn't reopen the door. That choice felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had, but it also felt clean. Winter approached again, slowly this time. My grandmother's health remained steady, not improving, not declining, just stable, which felt like a gift. We developed a rhythm, visits that were unremarkable in the best way, conversations that wandered and circled back. One evening, she asked me something I hadn't expected. Do you think I caused this? She said. I turned to her. No, I said immediately. She nodded, but I could see the doubt linger. I raised you both the same, she said. I don't know where it went wrong. I chose my words carefully. It didn't go wrong, I said. It just went differently. She smiled faintly. You always were the observant one. I realized then that I wasn't just protecting her anymore. I was modeling something. Boundaries without cruelty. Distance without hatred. Strength without spectacle. That mattered more than reconciliation ever could. As the year closed, I felt something settle fully into place. Not closure. Completion. The story with Elaine wasn't resolved in the way stories are supposed to be. There was no reunion, no apology that healed everything, no return to how it used to be. There was simply an ending where I no longer played the role that made the harm possible. That is a kind of ending people don't celebrate, but it is the kind that lasts. One chapter remained, not about family, about self, about what happens when you stop confusing endurance with virtue, and what it means to choose dignity even when it costs you the illusion of peace. I didn't mark the ending with anything symbolic. No final letter, no dramatic decision, no announcement. The last change happened on an ordinary morning, the kind that would have slipped by unnoticed before all of this. I woke up without the familiar weight in my chest. No urge to check my phone. No anticipation of someone else's crisis becoming my responsibility. Just quiet, steady awareness. That's how I knew it was over. Not because everyone had accepted it, because my body had. I went to see my grandmother later that day. We sat together by the window, watching the light shift across the courtyard. She was quieter than usual, thoughtful. You know, she said, after a while, when people stop fighting you, it doesn't always mean they agree. Sometimes it just means they understand you won't move. I nodded. I used to think strength meant holding on, she continued. Now I think it means knowing when to let go. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The work was already done. Elaine stayed distant. That distance eventually became permanent. We exchanged occasional updates through neutral channels. Facts, not feelings. Birthdays acknowledged. Holidays referenced but not shared. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cruel. It was honest. The family adjusted around that reality the way families always do. Awkwardly at first, then habitually, then without comment. People stopped asking when we'd reconcile. They started accepting that we hadn't. I learned something important during that time. When you stop offering yourself as the solution, people either grow or they look elsewhere. Elaine looked elsewhere, and that was no longer my concern. At work, I was promoted again. Not because I chased it, because I no longer flinched from responsibility that aligned with my values. I said yes when it made sense, no when it didn't, without apology. I built a life that didn't revolve around crisis management. One evening months later, I came home and noticed how quiet my apartment felt. Not empty, settled. I thought about the version of myself who sat in her car months earlier, reading an email labeled Family Update and feeling the first pull of erasure. That version of me didn't know yet that silence can be used against you, or that it can be reclaimed. I didn't win by exposing anyone. I didn't win by punishing anyone. I won by choosing myself without justification, by refusing to trade my autonomy for approval, by understanding that love which demands control is not love worth preserving. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors with locks, and you decide who gets the key. I didn't lose my family. I lost the version of family that required my compliance to function. What I gained was quieter, dignity, clarity. The freedom to exist without negotiating my worth. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life in it, remember this. You are not difficult for wanting respect. You are not selfish for choosing stability. And you are not wrong for stepping away from people who only feel close when they're in control. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining, stop absorbing, stop waiting for permission, and choose yourself. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. That's not abandonment. That's survival with integrity. And it changes everything.